Welcome to Ask a Meteorologist, answering your questions about aviation weather. We gathered a ton of questions and I went through and tried to do the best I could to kind of put all those together into a 5 or 6 different points at this point. So not going to answer every possible question you might have about aviation weather, but hopefully we'll hit a few that you were interested in. And for those who do not know me, I'm a CFI, been a CFI for about 25 years and a former National Weather Service meteorologist, been a meteorologist for about 45 years now. And if you are a subscriber to Flying Magazine, you may have seen a few articles I've written for them, been writing for them for about the last 2.5 years. And I'm also the founder of a progressive web app called EZWxBrief at EZWxBrief.com. And I'm the author of the SKU-T Log PME, a primer for pilots. It's available in both ebook and softcover format if you're interested in learning more about the SKU-T. And also the author of what's called Weather Essentials for Pilots, the SKU-T edition. It's an ebook format only. And so the first question, probably the biggest question I get from any kind of questions associated with datalink weather, it's how old is the weather I'm looking at on the screen? Now, we know that there are lots of observational data that comes in, METARs. There's also all the various different forecasts that we can look at. But I'm going to focus strictly on the radar mosaic in this particular section. So it's the age-old debate. How old is the picture I'm looking at? And certainly the answer to that question depends on a lot of factors, more than I'm really going to present here tonight. It really depends on the service you're using, and also, what product are you using to display that particular mosaic in the cockpit? Are you using Garmin Pilot, or using some other product to display that on an MFD, for instance, if you're using Avidyne equipment, for instance? All those elements depend on and process that data. It may do it in a little different way. So depending on what particular setup they're using may dictate just how old that particular display is. But let's walk through the basics. So both the government FISB from the ADSB and SiriusXM, they broadcast a mosaic that is not real time. Now, hopefully that's not news to anybody. Now, this is not like onboard radar, so it is not real-time data. And so when you receive the data in the cockpit, it's not likely to reflect what you see outside the other glass, that's called the windscreen, in the sense of comparing what you see on your display for your radar and what you see outside the window is going to be different. Now, a lot of that depends on if the weather's not moving a whole lot, it may match up pretty well. But if it's moving pretty quickly, you may find that that cell out there that you're seeing visually, and you're lining that up with what you're seeing on your iPad or your MFD, may not match up. And that's kind of what we're trying to get at, is just how old is this display? It's really essentially a glimpse of the recent past. Even so, it's really still incredibly useful. Probably one of the most useful tools we've had added to the cockpit since maybe GPS was added. Now, if you are you have been in the aviation industry for quite a while, you'll know that the NTSB and the FAA tend to be about 10 years behind the technology. I started using some of the satellite-based weather, some of the early forms of the XM weather, back in 2002 timeframe. And that's when we first started really seeing this, utilized by pilots in the cockpit. It was in early stages, but it wasn't until 2012, about 10 years later, the NTSB finally published a 3-page safety alert. It was later revised in December of 2015 that discusses the latency. And you can look at that URL at the bottom if you want to read that 3-page report completely. But what comes up at the top here, kind of the thing that stares you right in the face, is that the actual age of NextRad data can differ significantly from the age indicated on the display. That really pops in your face. So what happens is a lot of pilots immediately take that and they run with it and say, oh my gosh, the NextRad mosaic is really, really latent. And it could be in some cases, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But for the most part, this is what's staring you in the face. And even more, you scan down to read, and you'll see 15 to 20 minutes show up. Again, I'm just basically taking a cut and paste of the PDF that's out there on the internet. But if you read the fine print, it says, although such situations are not believed to be typical, extreme latency can occur. But the key element here is the situations are not believed to be typical. Yes, if you miss an update or 2 or 3, yes, the mosaic could be 15, 20, 25 minutes old. That's usually not the case. So by walking away from this and saying that the NextRad image is always going to be that you're looking at is always 20 minutes old or maybe even older is really no different than me telling you it's real time. I think that's a bad approach to do that. So unfortunately, there is no exact way to know the age of the radar mosaic. Unfortunately, I can't say it's 3 minutes or 4 minutes or 10 minutes old. It really depends on a lot of factors. So when you are looking, for instance, at, I use Garmin Pilot, if I'm looking at the list of all the products and when it was received, you'll see in this case, the US composite radar is 3 minutes old. Well, that's essentially when that particular product was received and processed and displayed on your screen. So that's the age that we're talking about here. That's not the age of the radar display you're looking at. That's when we can first possibly see that particular update. And of course, if that number goes up to 4 minutes, 5 minutes, 6 minutes, 7 minutes, 10 minutes old, it means that you're not, for some reason, not getting an update. And if that's the case, in this particular situation, this is the thing that a lot of pilots will go, well, this is 3 minutes old, so therefore I should assume that. No, this is actually when the product was received. So there are generally 5 areas of latency. First of all, the one that kind of is the biggest is the volume scan of the individual radars. And that's approximately 5 minutes. Then it takes some time to composite and ship it to SiriusXM or Harris if it's we're talking about the FSB product. And that's pretty quick. I say less than 20 seconds. It's probably even less than that. Then it takes some time to uplink it. And you have to remember that both of these services, SiriusXM and FSB, are both required to have bandwidth scheduling. There's not a lot of bandwidth there, so they have to schedule every single product. And then it takes some time to, when that packet is received, whether it's using Garmin Pilot or using Avidyne for your MFD, it's got to basically take all those packets and put them all together and render it on your display, and it takes some time to do that. And then you stare at the image for 2 minutes for FSB or 2.5 minutes for SiriusXM. So that's stare time. So again, at any point in time, your particular display might be looking at whether that's 5 minutes old, possibly 7 minutes old, depending on all the time in these latency areas. So when we're looking at a composite reflectivity, essentially, you have to think about that as having all slices, all elevation angles of the radars. So all the radars in the country, they're looking at all elevation angles. Then they find the value, the reflectivity value that is the largest in that column of air. And that's what you see on your particular cockpit display. And then each pixel that you see there could be a result of one of the elevation scans. And that elevation scan could be approximately 2 minutes old, or it could be 3 minutes or 5 minutes or 6 minutes old, depending again on just how much, how quickly that particular display was rendered. So each of these pixels are, in many cases, all come from potentially different elevation scans. And so essentially what the providers of this data do is they don't really care that the volume coverage pattern is complete for any particular radar. If a radar is on the third elevation scan, it'll look at the third elevation, it'll look at the second, it'll look at the first, then it'll go back to the previous volume scan and look at the 14th elevation, 13th, 12th, and so on. And so it really doesn't really depend on having all the radars in sync in any way. Instead, it's going out and looking what data is available at the time that that particular composite is generated and then shipped along and either uplinked to the satellite or to the ground-based systems. So what you end up with is, on average, again, looking at every pixel, anywhere from 3.5 minutes, maybe all the way up to 7 minutes old when it's first displayed on your screen. Of course, you have no idea what pixel is what age. So if you really want to be conservative, you lean more to that 7-minute side in terms of the actual age of the product you're looking at. So definitely it's not real time, but it's still incredibly useful. The refresh rate on the SiriusXM radar Mosaic is 2.5 minutes. That means every 2.5 minutes, they go back and build a brand new Mosaic that's basically uplinked to the satellite and then broadcast down to you. So every 2 minutes, we get a new update. And so in that particular case, you're going to get a refresh at a 2.5 minute interval. And so that's particular uplinked at specific times, because again, they have to schedule every one of these products that gets sent up there, whether it's METARs, whether it's looking at AirMets, SIGMETs, center weather advisories, whatever the case may be. All that has to be set at specific times so that we're not flooding the pipe. And unfortunately, there's absolutely nothing you can really do to decrease this latency. I've had people ask me, is there a way to make this show up quicker? It really isn't, essentially. So when you're looking at any of this information, you always should keep this in mind, and always should be used for strategic decision making. So one pro tip that I have for everybody is that pay attention as you are utilizing this product. And if you're going from point A to point B, while you're en route, if you catch yourself consistently making more than a 30-degree heading change for avoidance, you're probably going to be considered to be too close to the adverse weather, and you're making decisions too late. So take notice of just how, when you see, let's say, for instance, you're flying along and you see some weather that's in the distance, and you decide that you're just going to wait and see what happens, and you find out that as soon as you get to the point where you're like, I think I need to go around this, and you start catching yourself doing 30, 40, 50-degree heading changes, that means you're probably not using it the way that it's intended to be used, as a strategic kind of planning tool. So yes, if you need to make that 60-degree heading change to avoid weather, you got to do it. But you should make that the exception, not the rule. In most cases, when I'm flying, especially if I can get up much higher, most of the time I can see the enemies in the distance. I can know where they are visually. And I can then look down at my display and determine, yeah, I need about a 10-degree left to get around this particular weather. Keep me on the weather in a way that I can go around it, especially if the weather's moving. I can go around it so it's moving away from where I'm headed. That's the best way to use this, rather than to try to have to worry about using it to thread between a bunch of cells. Generally not advised to do that. All right, question number 2. And a question about what's the difference between echo tops versus cloud tops? Now, any type of tops are what I consider the holy grail of aviation weather. It's likely the question I get the most is, Scott, tell me how I can determine where the tops are. And it makes sense because pilots want to know the altitude of that, where the top of the cloud deck is. Maybe it's due to staying above an icing layer. Maybe you just like to be in clear conditions, flying through the clouds. Maybe you're a VFR and you want to fly over top of the clouds. Whatever the case may be, knowing where those tops are quite important to most pilots. And again, it's understandable that they want to know that. So there are really 2 different flavors of tops. That includes echo tops, which only is provided by SiriusXM right now. And there are cloud tops, which FISB and SiriusXM both provide. So those are the 2 different flavors of tops. So let's look at both of these so we can better understand what they're telling us. So let's start talking right now about datalink echo tops. Again, if you're using FISB, you're not going to see this particular product. But with the SiriusXM products, echo tops is one of those that you're going to get. So echo tops are basically sewing together all the various different NexRad echo tops products. So one of the volume products that is put out by NexRad is called echo tops. And essentially, that represents the altitude of the top of the precipitation core. So think about a thunderstorm. A thunderstorm has some kind of precipitation core. What we want to find out is, where is the top of that precipitation core? What is the highest point where you see the 18 dBz level? And we know that the NexRad depiction that you see is based on this thing called decibels of Z, where Z is the reflectivity parameter. And so what we do is we find out, where is the highest point where 18 dBz occurs. And you can see here that I've got showing here that white kind of squiggly line kind of connecting the dots of that 18 dBz level. And so for this particular cross section of this thunderstorm, you can see here, imagine taking a thunderstorm and slicing it from one point to the next. I've sliced that in this particular case. You'll see that 56,000 feet here is the echo top of this particular thunderstorm at the highest tops. But if you go on the sides of the thunderstorm itself, the echo tops are going to be much lower, of course. But the cloud tops probably are going to be higher than this, and most definitely higher in most situations. But this is what essentially is the echo top product. It tells you the top of that precipitation core. Now, we generally look at echo tops to determine the vertical extent of convective precipitation. So meteorologists, if they want to see which storm is more severe than another, they're going to look at the echo tops. And echo tops that are in the 45, 50, 55,000 feet are typically going to be where you're seeing some really severe thunderstorms. And certainly pilots can do the same thing. You want to keep your distance away from severe thunderstorms. You've probably heard the 20-mile rule to say, stay away from any kind of thunderstorm by 20 miles. If it's severe, that's pretty naive. You really need to be more like 50 miles away from those kind of cells. So when you start seeing echo tops up there in the 50 and 55 range, I give myself a lot more room to circumnavigate those kind of cells. So again, the echo tops are looking at, what is the vertical extent of that precipitation core. But because it really requires precipitation, it's really not going to tell you where the tops of the stratus deck are. Without any precipitation, you don't get any returns. Therefore, you can't see where the tops are associated with it. So it's not a product that's going to tell you that if I take off and there's a stratiform cloud deck and the bases of that deck are, let's say, 1,000 feet, and I'm going to pop out on top at 5,000 feet, it's not going to be able to tell you that unless there's some precipitation occurring. But generally, you're going to require a much deeper weather system to see that. So with SiriusXM, this is showing with Garmin Pilot, for instance, you can bring up the echo tops, and they're color coded in this gray color coding, and then you can overlay over top of that the lightning, so you can see where the nasty areas of weather are located. But you also want to add, for instance, the SIGMETs over top of that. And this is true whether you're looking at even a FISBE, although FISBE doesn't have echo tops, but still, anytime you're looking at a convective weather, it's also a good idea to overlay not only lightning, but also overlay the other advisories, such as convective SIGMETs. Putting those together really gives you an indication, again, where the truly ugly weather is and where you have to stay away from. The other thing that comes along with these echo tops is these things called storm cell attributes. They also show kind of the maximum echo top height in the cell. So the next-rad radars are tracking these cells, and as part of that, they're trying to locate where that center of that cell is, where that kind of that middle part of that cell is, and they'll put essentially a marker at that point, and then you can then from that determine its movement, for instance. So in many cases, you can actually you can look at, for instance, the cell here near the bottom. It says 20,000 feet, and it's got an arrow pointed to the right. That basically tells you that that particular cell is 20,000 foot echo top, is the highest top in that area, and it's expected to move to the east. And each one of those segments there is a 20-minute interval. So it's expected to make the first little hash mark there is 20 minutes, and then 40 minutes and 60 minutes and so on. So ultimately, what you can see here is the movement of those cells. But that number that's sitting there is the echo top height. Now, you don't see any echo tops, for instance, at say 150 or 100 for 15 and 10,000 feet. Again, because you don't start seeing these starting to be produced until you get to about 20,000 feet in terms of that echo top height. So basically, anytime you see one of these storm cell attributes, either with a line or without a line, that's a good indication that this is probably a pretty ugly cell and you probably should avoid it, even if there's no lightning. Notice I have lightning turned on here, and there's not a single lightning strike anywhere in the area here. So these are essentially rain showers, which may turn into full-blown thunderstorms. But even so, these are something that you definitely should avoid. Now let's focus cloud tops. So cloud tops are generally the altitude where you see the highest layer of clouds. You can have multiple layers. There could be a cirrus layer way up there, and essentially the cloud tops, up there at 25,000 feet, even though there may be a lot of clear air below, that cloud top would be the cirrus deck at that point. And so both SiriusXM and FISBE broadcast cloud tops. And there's one critical difference that's really important. And that is SiriusXM broadcasts actual cloud tops, anything that happens above 5,000 feet, based on satellite imagery. It basically uses the cloud top temperature. If you know the cloud top temperature, which comes from the satellite information, that the geosynchronous satellites that are out there looking at the clouds across the Earth, it's actually also can then determine what the temperature of those cloud tops are. And if you know the temperature, you can basically look and say, where does that temperature occur aloft? And then you can put a height on that. And that's a way that can be used using actual cloud top information, observable data, essentially. Whereas FISBE broadcasts a 1 or 2 hour forecast from the high resolution rapid refresh model. So it's a forecast of cloud tops. It's not using actual cloud top information. And so you might say, well, gee, I really don't care as long as it's pretty accurate. And generally speaking, both of these are going to be fairly accurate, but you can't get away from the fact that when you use actual information, observation data, that's going to be always much better than what essentially a forecast model is looking at. So here's an example of a miss from this high resolution rapid refresh model that's used for the cloud tops. Now, this doesn't show you cloud tops. On the left here, what you see is a simulated radar reflectivity. This is a 1 hour forecast from the high resolution rapid refresh model valid at 14Z. Now, if I compare that to the actual NEXRAD image that occurred at this time at 14Z, you'll notice that here over Shreveport, there was definitely some precipitation occurring there. But if you go back over to the left and say, did the forecast turn out pretty well? It didn't. It actually missed this whole area. And as you can only imagine, again, I didn't have cloud tops to show you here, but you can only imagine the cloud top forecast would have been probably pretty bad. So if you're coming through this area, you would have been very much surprised that the cloud top information from the FISB would have not captured this very well. And this happens not frequently, but it happens often enough that I personally would rather trust the cloud top information from SiriusXM because it is actual tops. All right, so one of the questions we had a lot is, what are the differences between FISB and SiriusXM? And again, there's lots and lots of things that we could certainly talk about here, but I want to focus on a few key items. So if you fly with both FISB and SiriusXM, I do as well. I use a GDL52. It's a portable unit displayed on my Garmin Pilot, so I can see both of these products. So the raw data source itself that you get is really the same. The National Weather Service NEXRAD radars send all the same information, have all the same information. It's basically how that information is taken and utilized with respect to FISB and SiriusXM. And that's going to mean that you're not going to get the same product in the end that ends up being shipped to the cockpit. Unfortunately, because of the fact that you have two different organizations processing this data, and it's going to be processed slightly different. And so FISB uses what's called the multi-radar, multi-sensor mosaic that is broadcast over the ground-based radar systems, ground-based systems of towers that broadcast the FISB products. So the MRMS is actually a pretty darn good overall product, but again, it has its flaws. SiriusXM, that vendor uses its own method that's not necessarily the same as what you see from the MRMS. And essentially, what it comes down to is just how well the filtering is done, because both of these systems, they want to give you essentially a product that only has real precipitation, doesn't have any other ground clutter or anomalous propagation, which we'll talk about in a bit. They want to have a particular mosaic that represents reality. Where is it precipitating? And everything else is removed that's not precipitation. To do that is essentially easier said than done. So again, the raw NEXRAD data comes from all these different NEXRAD Doppler radars out there that you see here, one out of Norman, Oklahoma. And it contains returns from what are called hydrometeors, which are basically rain and snow and hail and ice pellets, and also non-hydrometeor sources. So that would be insects and birds. Chaff from military aircraft may contain information or things on even airplanes produce targets sometimes. And also there's ground clutter and anomalous propagation that can work its way through. So it's not a pure answer to the question of only having areas of precipitation that are occurring at this time. It's going to have a lot of other stuff with it. And so again, both of these strive to remove any non-precipitation returns so that you have a display that only shows you really where it's precipitating. However, there are some things like ground clutter and anomalous propagation that kind of sneak through sometimes and don't get filtered properly. This doesn't happen a lot, but when it does, it'll get your attention for sure. So if you're looking at this particular presentation you see on the right, this is the NexRad, a single site mosaic from for radar for reflectivity. Can you pick out the real precipitation? For a lot of pilots, they would look at that and go, wow, it looks pretty nasty. I don't know that I want to be flying on the east side or north or even south of Indianapolis there. That looks pretty nasty. Well, it turns out that most of what you're looking at is not real returns. The only stuff that's real is in that white circle there. And you might think, well, Scott, how do I know this? Well, you're going to always want to compare what you see in the cockpit to something else. So you try to compare this to other things like surface observations. Is it really precipitating in this area? You're going to see METARs that have precipitation like rain or snow or thunderstorms if it really was raining there. You're going to look at satellite images, for instance, and compare and contrast that if you're on the ground when you're trying to understand this as well. So ultimately, you can see here that that the satellite image, the visible satellite image, gives you a good indication that where you see the kind of the white puffy clouds there in the dashed white circle, that's a really good indication of that's where the clouds are and that's where the precipitation is. And that's what you see here on the NexRad image. All the other stuff is basically called anomalous propagation, all due to various different things that happen to the radar beam, which ends up being ducted and potentially striking objects in the distance and coming back to the radar and being reported as a strong reflectivity when it's really not there. So again, the filtering sometimes works flawlessly and you get a really beautiful view, and sometimes it doesn't, unfortunately. So when it doesn't work well, you may end up with some of these artifacts kind of slipping through. And this is where it becomes, you have to be your pilot command and you have to look at this stuff and try to figure it out. And I know I've gotten a lot of people send me via email or text and say, Scott, I saw this when I was flying along and I took a screenshot and I was looking outside. It was a crystal clear blue day. And it looked like it was a major thunderstorm ahead of me and it wasn't really there. What was going on? And that's likely what was happening here. So this may lead to cases where you might see the FISB and SiriusXM mosaic might look a little different. So if you're comparing the two of them, you might see what essentially looks like a completely different view of things. And so if you can fly with both and show both, this is even better. But ultimately, look at other products to make sure that what you're seeing out the window and what you're seeing on your display certainly makes sense. So here's an example. This was an early example back from 2007. I was making a flight. This is the early XM weather product itself. But you can see here that all those cells, they look pretty serious. They look like there's some really nasty thunderstorm cells there that you see. And it's for a lot of pilots, they would look at that and be pretty scared to fly through that area. But is it real? Well, let's look at what's happening here. So what's happening is that you notice up here, this is from the Atlanta radar. You notice up in that, up toward the top there with that black circle around it, that really looks like some really weird, almost, I hate to say it, Skittles looking kind of colors up there in the corner. That turns out that this is an anomalous propagation scenario where it's pulling in like we saw on the other one in Indianapolis. So this is not really real returns, but it's being captured and therefore, unfortunately, not filtered properly, and it slips through. So if you look at the adjacent radar here up to the north and look in that same area, it's nothing there. And so, unfortunately, in this particular case, XM did not do a good enough job filtering this. And again, it slipped through. Now, it may only slip through for 1 or 2 or 3 cycles, but if you happen to be, your flight path happen to be going through the area, again, this will get your attention big time. And again, if you look at the visible satellite image, there's really no major thunderstorms in this area. Yes, there's some clouds in that area, but none of these look really nasty from that standpoint. No big buildups in the area, and certainly nothing there on the other radar, adjacent radar sites. So again, all this tells us that this is anomalous kind of propagation. And so what happens is we typically sometimes, the atmosphere itself really is what causes this. We get in what's called an elevated temperature inversion here. You can see the SKU-T diagram here out of Atlanta shows this elevated temperature inversion, and that will duct the radar beam down toward the surface, sometimes striking even mountains or striking other terrain, and that eventually comes back the same way that it went there through a ducting mechanism back to the radar, and it's interpreted. Now, the hope is that your satellite weather system will recognize that this is occurring, and it will filter out those returns. Here's another one. So clearly there are returns west of Charlotte here and north of Atlanta. You can see definitely returns there, and there's a lot of ground clutter around the radar site at the Greenville-Spartanburg Weather Forecast Office there where the radar is, but you can clearly see there's returns there. But let's take a look at what was happening in this case with XM weather. You can see there's no returns there just to the west of Charlotte, and over the Atlanta, North Atlanta, you see a couple zigzags there. That's lightning strikes. And then you can see a little bit further to the west of Atlanta, there's definitely some cells there. But why are the other two not showing up? And here's a closer look here. And so notice that there are lightning bolts there, and there's actually one of those storm cell tracks showing up as well, but no green, no red, no orange, no yellow, nothing showing up for the returns themselves. This was at 14:10 Eastern Daylight Time, and the very next update, bam, it came in. And so what essentially was happening is that at this particular time, they were using a gross filter because in this particular area, they weren't expecting convection, but unfortunately, they didn't remove the filter quick enough. And all of a sudden, you see this cell pop up as they remove that filter. So they were trying to do the job of removing all the bad stuff out there that you don't want to see in terms of ground clutter, but unfortunately, in this case, they removed real returns. That does happen from sometimes, but again, the whole idea here is make sure that you know that this also occurs with FSBE as well. So make sure you have those storm cell identification tracks turned on if that's a possibility on the device you're using, along with lightning. So those are typically not filtered out like you see. So having those on together really will give you the idea that something else is there and I've got to pay attention to it, even if you don't see the returns that you would normally see if it hadn't been filtered. So again, this is really what you're trying to do the best you can at getting from point A to point B, but you're also going to have to contend with these issues that pop up from time to time. All right, so let me just kind of finish up here with 5 things you're going to check before flight. One of the questions was, give me just 5 things I need to check before each and every flight. Well, I think pilot reports happen to be the number one thing. Pilot weather reports are, kind of by far one of the best things to check right before you're going to close the door on the cockpit to depart. They're the eyes and ears of, if you will, of weather, what's going on. So if they exist and they're out there, they may be very helpful to help us understand where the tops may be, where there's severe turbulence, where there's icing potential. All those things are important to us as pilots. And pilot weather reports, probably provide us with some of the most important information out there. So, as an add-on to that, if you're out there, take some time to make that pilot weather report to help somebody else out. Even if it's negative turbulence, negative icing, that's really an important thing to put out there because you never know. 2,000 feet above you, you may be getting the crap kicked out of you in terms of turbulence. So you may be flying here at, let's say 8,000 feet and be in smooth conditions, but at 10,000 feet might be a whole different story. So there may be somebody at 10,000 feet looking for smooth air. By having that negative report, you can actually tell them about that. So once you get about 75 minutes old, generally speaking, pilot reports age out overall. So after 75 minutes of time, if it's older than 75 minutes, I don't generally look at it. And so basically, this is the kind of the use before date, if you will. So anything older than 75 minutes is historically known to be not as relevant. And so in case my EZWxBrief app, for instance, I have it set up specifically so that when you're looking at a particular time, you set the departure advisor on a particular time, this will only show you those pilot weather reports that are within the last 75 minutes for that purpose. And of course, the next tip is make sure that you have your SIGMETs turned on. I mean, SIGMETs are, whether it be SIGMETs for severe turbulence or severe icing or even convection, all these are advisories for actual conditions, meaning that it's rare for a forecaster to issue a SIGMET without having some ground truth, if you will, meaning that there are other pilots out there reporting severe turbulence or severe ice, as the case may be. So ultimately, anytime you see a SIGMET, you know that there is an area where there's actual reports. In fact, it will usually say, in this particular case, the SIGMET says reported by A320. So ultimately, this is kind of the front lines, if you will. And so it's really good to make sure that you always are looking at this before you depart. And these SIGMETs for especially severe turbulence and severe icing generally live and die by pilot weather reports. Unless pilots start reporting those conditions, you won't see these SIGMETs. And this is not something, even though it's considered a forecast and is valid for 4 hours, in most cases, these really don't start to be issued until pilots report those conditions. Again, convective SIGMETs, same kind of a thing. They tell you about where there's actual convection that meets certain criteria. So this is not a forecast of what's going to happen in the next 2 to 3 hours. This is telling you what's happening right now. And so this particular SIGMET for convection, especially if you see the term EMBD, which stands for embedded thunderstorms, that's really where you can't, in embedded thunderstorms, you can't pick out where that thunderstorm is. It's embedded in a bunch of overcast. Those are the most dangerous ones because we can't visually see those. If you have a little single cell out there in the distance, you can visually see it and you can go around it. In this particular case, you really can't. Convective outlooks are probably one of the most underutilized products out there as far as that goes. They basically tell you, they're issued by the same forecasters at the Aviation Weather Center that issue the SIGMETs, but they tell you an area, a bigger area, where in the next 2 to 6 hours, where it's likely to have thunderstorms or convection forming that meets that SIGMET criteria. So this is kind of very unique to the aviation world. This doesn't tell you about where all thunderstorms might be, but those that are important for aviation. And important for aviation means that they're embedded, they're possibly severe, they're in long lines or big areas that where you have to worry about, so you have to get around this particular area of weather. I'm going to eat into my fuel reserves. Whereas if there's just a bunch of little what we would call scattered or isolated thunderstorms in the area, you can visually see those, you can work your way through those without too much difficulty. Those really are not significant to aviation. Yes, you don't want to fly through one of those, but there's a lot of room to work around those. Center weather advisories, again, another kind of front lines of aviation weather. These are issued by the Center Weather Service units at all the route centers around the country. And again, this is really the front lines of aviation weather. The nice thing about these CWAs is that there's really not any kind of significant hard and fast rules for these. So they could have an area building towering cumulus, for instance, out there where you're dealing with some heavy precipitation in the area. They can issue a center weather advisory for that particular situation. Or you can be dealing with moderate turbulence, maybe occasionally severe, and it doesn't really meet the SIGMET criteria, but nevertheless, they can still put out a turbulence center weather advisory. And so again, center weather advisories are issued by the meteorologists at all these various different centers around the country. And last but not least, the SKU-T diagrams. If you're interested in learning more about weather, these are a perfect tool to use as drill down. And you probably will find that you can get more information from SKU-T than you can get from a lot of other different guidance out there.
Scott, we have a few questions here. So first question from Dan is, Scott, why do clouds form in multiple separate layers? For example, when you see a TAF with 1,500 feet, few clouds, 2,200 broken, 3,500 broken, 7,000 overcast. Why do they form in those multiple separate layers?
That's a great question, Dan. Here's the kind of the short version or answer to this question. Normally, when you see a METAR that has multiple cloud layers, it'll say like scattered 200 or scattered 2,000. Maybe it says broken 2,500. Broken 3,500 or something like that. That usually tells you have a convective process in place. And again, not necessarily thunderstorms. We're not talking about that, but vertically developed clouds, often in many cases, you'll see those multiple layers. So as that weather is moving over a sensor, for instance, over an ASOS or AWOS, it's going to pick up on all those different, kind of formations of clouds that you see and report those multiple layers. And so that's a really good indication, especially if you know that, let's say, by the afternoon time, you're going to get maybe some thunderstorms or convection in a particular area. When you start to see the METARs report those three or so layers, that's a good indication you're starting that convective process.
Great, thanks, Scott. Another question is, what is the earliest stage of a thunderstorm that will be recognized as lightning by a storm scope? Is that one that you're aware of, Scott?
Yes, so that's an interesting question. A storm scope is a great tool if you know how to use it properly, and it tells you anytime there's a discharge that goes on that has some vertical component, which most lightning strikes do, it will pick up that particular strike and then display it on your storm scope or on your multifunction display, as the case may be. Now, in some cases, you can have most lightning strikes to airplanes are not due to natural lightning. Most of it's aircraft induced, meaning if you remember the Apollo 12 years and years ago, there was 2 strikes to that vehicle as it was lifting off from Florida, and that was induced by the actual rocket itself. The same thing happens with airplanes. Most airplanes get struck by lightning, not because of a thunderstorm in the area, but because of that static discharge that occurs. Now, in many cases, when you start getting to the point where the tops of those clouds break through the freezing level and become tops about -10 Celsius or colder, you can start potentially pulling in some electrical discharges in those particular cases. So, for instance, let's say the freezing level is in the summertime, let's say it's about 16,000 feet. It's probably not until you're probably going to be tops around 25,000 feet where you'll start to get that first possible lightning strike that may occur in that particular cell. Of course, in the colder atmospheres in the spring and the fall, that may actually be a little bit lower. So usually when you get a depth of over 15,000 feet, total depth from the base of the cloud up, and again, where the tops are, somewhere in the -10 or colder range, that's when you're first going to start to see that first lightning strike that you might see on your storm scope.
Great. All right, last question for you, Scott. From Donald, have the SKU-T models on NOAA been turned off permanently? Is there any way to obtain SKU-T forecast and interpolation? All of my various SKU-T apps have died.
Yes, I would have to apologize to all those out there that are SKU-T junkies like me. Unfortunately, the NOAA site, rucksoundings.noaa.gov, was taken out of commission. And that's going to be a potential thing we're going to see coming up. It was removed for the purposes of saying they don't want you using that particular site for any kind of formal decision making because it's a research organization. And as a result of that, they said it would be best not to put it out there. They're actually, if you want to email me, send an email to support@EZWxBrief.com. and you want to know more details about where to go to get that, probably best to do that. And I can certainly email you back and give you some of that information. But we're starting to see that happen a lot throughout all of the National Service and NOAA. And who knows what's going to happen in the future with respect to this next administration coming in. There have been talk about removing a lot of this low-hanging fruit, if you will, all this free stuff that's out there. So we'll have to kind of monitor that. But right now, that particular site is down or gone, and it's not coming back at all. And actually, I'm building a new tool into a SKUT into my tool, my EZWxBrief, that will hopefully be ready for public consumption sometime in next year. But yeah, send me an email and I'll give you a lot more information than I can do over this webinar.
Great. All right. That was all of our questions, Scott.